Welcome, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. This is the Barriger Summer Seminar. This is our June 2021 seminar. And we have been doing these ever since COVID started, and we lost our traditional in-person events. And we've been, this is our third and hopefully in a continuing series. Given the success we've had both here at the Barriger and at the Mercantile in general, we're gonna probably keep these going. If nothing else, because folks who just can't get to St. Louis to see these in person normally now have a chance to join us remotely. And if you're interested in the topic, you can go ahead and join us without having to pay for the plane ticket and rental car and hotel to join something here at the Mercantile Library. So this seminar, just a quick review of how we run these. If you've never been with us before, we use the chat function in Zoom for questions and answers, and that helps us manage everybody asking questions in an orderly manner. What usually is going to happen is when the questions come up, I will read them to our presenter and then they'll answer. These are going to be recorded sessions. So if you aren't able to attend the whole event, you can join us later on. And if you do have a question, you don't have to wait till the end. You go ahead and just go ahead and type it into the chat function. And that way we'll go through that as we go through the day. So we have at least two great presentations. I'm not going to talk about mine, but Bernie Kempinski and John Ott are joining us. We are bi-coastal, truly transcontinental, which is appropriate for a 19th century railroad theme here, where we're going to be talking about the early days of railroading in the US. So our first presenter is going to be Bernard Kempinski, and he's going to be talking about his modeling of the 1863 Aquia branch line of the U.S. military railroad. His talk's going to be Introduction to Railroads in the Civil War. And Bernard lives in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. He is a published author and accomplished model railroader. If you haven't had the chance to look at his website, which we linked on the invitation, I highly recommend it. His work is fantastic. And if you're a Civil War buff, it's a bonus because he does some wonderful military modeling and railroad modeling. So without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Bernie. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. Let's see. All right, so I have to share a screen. All right, there we go. Thanks, Nick, for the introduction and invitation to do this talk. And I will be talking about introduction of railroads of the Civil War. And as Nick mentioned, I am not a professional historian. I'm a model builder. And so what you're about to see is some of the results of the research I did in trying to build my railroad to the best extent that I could. So here's the I actually like to start my talk out with this quote, and I'll give you a second to read it. And I just would like you to wonder, who do you think said that? You don't have to respond, I'll tell you in a second. But this was actually a quote from Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs. And so he was describing his train ride on his way to West Point, which was the first time he ever rode a train. That was in the 1830s. So the Civil War started in the 1860s. So in those 30 years, the railroads of the United States and around the world underwent a rapid development. But railroads were still in their infancy at that time. And so we as modern observers, we can look at a railroad and look at pictures from then and recognize that it's a railroad. But we have to remember that everything was slightly different, not just in the technology they were using, but even the way people dressed. And so that's what I'm going to cover in this talk. This is the outline that I'm going to follow, and it's broken in two parts. If we run out of time, we'll skim through part 2. But first, we'll talk about just the prototype railroads and what was going on back then. Look at the network, how the North and the South compared, the roles of the railroad, the roles that they played in logistics. Since some of us are modelers, we like to talk about the equipment and the rolling stock. And then I'll briefly cover infrastructure and talk about how the railroads operated. And again, if we have time, I'll go into my own model railroad. So let's start with this quote that Sherman wrote. You won't find this in Sherman's memoirs, but it's cited in other documents. And if you read this, you'll see that he basically predicted the outcome of the war. He wrote this when he was, or said this at a dinner, a farewell dinner, when he was at the Louisiana Military Academy that he helped found. And he went north to fight for the Union, and those fellows went south and fought for the Southerners. So you can see that if you read this, he has predicted the outcome of the war. So what was Sherman talking about? Well, let's look at a map of the United States at the start of the Civil War. And first thing you'll notice that this is a war of continental scope. The states in green down here are the southern states that have seceded from the Union. And to bring them back, the North is going to have to invade those states and reinstitute federal control. And if you look at the distance from Val Verde, which is over here by El Paso, all the way to Gettysburg, you'll see that that is the same distance as Paris to Moscow. And so we're talking about invading a country of continental scope. Okay, so people ask, why did the war take so long? Well, that's one of the reasons. It just was a vast area that had to be conquered and largely empty. When you look at the populations, you'll see the North had 22 million people, the South had 9.1. So that's almost two to one advantage. But then when you consider that 40% roughly of the Southern population were slaves and not eligible for military service, you're almost looking at a 4-to-1 manpower advantage for the Union. And the little fellows here with the muskets shows what percentage of the population served in the military. And you can see that's roughly a little over 10% for the Southerners and a similar number, actually less than 10% for the Union. Now, in terms of gross national product, the United States was largely agrarian. So you see that our gross national product at the time was $4 billion. And this is in then year dollars. I did not bring it forward into current year dollars, but the North had about a 3-to-1 advantage over the South in terms of just output, but it was 10-to-1 when you look at industrial capacity. So what that means is of this $3 billion, $2 billion and change was actually just agricultural products. And so, people say that the North was industrialized, the South was not. Well, the North was largely agrarian, and it did have extensive industry, but most people back then were still engaged in farming. And if you look on the Southern side, you'll see that about 40% of their industrial output was slave labor. And this wasn't just slaves, happily working on plantations like some people like you to believe. This is slaves working in factories. And another thing that people don't think about is that the slaves actually built most of the Southern railroads, and most Southern railroads listed slaves as capital assets that they owned, which they did lose at the end of the war. So for example of locomotive production, for industrial output, you can look at locomotive production, and you can see that the North was producing roughly 450, and it went up during the war. They're producing around 500 locomotives a year. The South produced 19 locomotives in the first year of the war, and then produced 0 for the rest of the war. They just did not have the capability to make all the parts necessary for locomotives. Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond, which I'll show you a picture in a second, could make locomotives, but the government prioritized them, and they're largely made artillery and weapons. They also made some armor plate, and they could have made rail, they could have made locomotives, but they could only do so much. When you look at the amount of track that you have, you see the South had 9,000, which is a respectable number, although considering the size of the country, maybe not, but that would be equal to about what Germany or England or France had at the start of the war. And the North had twice that. And they also built 5,000 more miles during the war, whereas the South lost mileage. And by the end of the war, the South was down to about 2,000 actual usable miles of railroad track. Okay, so I mentioned Tredegar Ironworks. This top picture is a photo, it's back here. This ironworks that's located in Richmond produced half of the iron for the South. The rest of it was scattered in different countries, or sorry, different states. And Birmingham had a few, and there were a couple others. There was one on the W&A north of Atlanta. Meanwhile, in the north, ironworks like this were scattered all over, and not just in the areas we think about now in terms of the steelmaking areas, like the Pittsburgh area really wasn't that well developed back then. A lot of it was in New York, the anthracite areas of Pennsylvania. There were ironworks in New Jersey that were utilizing the iron that, it's called bog iron, that was actually formed in the water that they had over there. And there were even some in Massachusetts and other places. And those wore out quickly, and now the iron industry is concentrated in the Pittsburgh area and the Chicago area in the United States. So I like to just say one of the things that, one of the advantages the North had as a result of this industrial capacity was they had an overwhelming logistical advantage. And these pictures just give you some examples of what the North could do. So up here in the corner, we see bridges that are being prefabricated in Alexandria to rapidly repair bridges. However, I have not found any evidence that these particular bridges were actually used. But both sides, particularly the North, got very good at repairing bridges during the war. And here we see a line of artillery being stored at City Point. That's showing the industrial might of the Union. But more importantly, we see African-American soldier here who is guarding those weapons. And after a point, the United States created the United States Military Colored Troops, who were roughly 200, 300,000 soldiers that joined the Union, and it further exacerbated the northern manpower advantage. And down here in Alexandria, which is where I live now, we can see a stockpile of rail being stored just in case they need it. Whereas I mentioned earlier, the South had really no capability to make rail, or they could, but they prioritized against it. So whenever the South wanted to build a new line, they had to either tear up an existing line or basically do without. And I'll show you some examples later. Whereas the North had rail just laying around just in case. There were some other differences between the North and the South railroads. I call them political differences. And every one of these resulted in an advantage for the North. Okay, so just the way the tracks were laid out, the way the rails developed, was an advantage for the North because they had 3 or 4 lines that crossed the Appalachians. And why did these railroads develop? Well, they were developed to bring Western grain to Eastern industrial sites. Also, during the Civil War, there was a grain shortage in Europe. And so lots of these Midwestern farmers were shipping grain by the railroad to Eastern ports where it was being exported to Europe. In fact, the further north you go, the less military traffic the railroads were hauling. So for example, the B&O, which was the railroad in the North that was right on the border of the South, they had about 30% military traffic. And that ratio dropped lower and lower until you got to the New York Central predecessor railroads, which had about 2% military traffic. And as far as they were concerned, in that regard, there wasn't a war going on and they were busy shipping stuff to Europe. Another factor is this private ownership, laissez-faire versus centralized control. And so the North was a strong federal government, and Northern railroads knew that if they did not cooperate with the government, they would be nationalized. And the United States government did form the U.S. Military Railroad in 1862 to manage any railroad that the government deemed necessary to prosecute the war. Well, it turns out that they were almost only used in states that were being reoccupied by the North, except in one example at the Battle of Gettysburg, the U.S. Military Railroad took control of the Western Maryland Railroad to support the Battle of Gettysburg. And they had to, in that particular case, the railroad was running at about 10 times its normal capacity. Whereas in the South, because of the private ownership and states' rights attitude of the governments, they were very loath to any kind of federal control. And it wasn't until March of 1865 that the South created sort of a unified military control, but by then it was too late. It didn't really have any effect. Another factor is this below market versus above market fares or market rates. So in the North, the northern railroads were paid by the government market or above market rates to ship military cargo. So railroad owners were capitalists. They wanted to make money. So by shipping military cargo, they were able to make a profit. Whereas Southern railroads, at least initially, leaned on the patriotism of their railroad owners and asked for below market rates. But they were, again, were capitalists, and they would rather ship civilian cargo where they could charge and make a profit than military cargo. So as early as 1862, you can read letters from Robert E. Lee to Richmond complaining about how the RF&P Railroad is not providing him with adequate supplies. And in fact, he had to scatter his troops up through North Carolina and way out to the Shenandoah Valley to forage because he could not get the proper supplies right at Fredericksburg where he was stationed. So this next 2 points, no interchange between competent railroads, is kind of hard for us today to think that railroads back then would not interchange cars. Okay, and it wasn't because there was no standard gauge, because there was this, primarily most railroads in the North were 4 foot 8.5, and in the South, they were mostly 5 foot, although I'll show you a chart in a second. Railroads back then thought that if they let their cars go into the hands of another railroad, they would never see them again. And so they did not really want to interchange. Furthermore, there was this problem that there was some standard gauge issues, but also railroads did not actually connect in the towns. And one of the themes I say that is common themes that we see is that nothing changes in our governments. And back then we had the lobbyists for the Teamsters and the lobbyists for the railroads and hoteliers, I mean, at the state level, lobbying against railroads connecting in their towns. The reason for this is they wanted you to be forced to come into their town, stay in a hotel, have a Teamster haul your stuff across town, and then go into the next station, get on the train, and leave the next day. So they didn't want you to simply zip through their town because they didn't want to lose the business. And that was the way railroads were built back then, and I'll show you some examples in a second. And as I mentioned, there was no standard gauge, and I'll show you that. There were approximately 13 different gauges in use at the time of the Civil War. So let's just see what kind of effect did railroad travel have on transportation back then. So if you look at 1800 and the times of George Washington, it took a long time to get anywhere. Mostly by, one time Washington walked from Fort Necessity to Philadelphia and back, and it took him a month. Not Washington himself, but some of his messengers. By 1830, as steamboats and things started to come around, the transportation got a little better and the railroads started up at that time period. And then by 1857, at the start of the war, you could get from New York to Richmond in about a day, which is about what it takes nowadays with traffic on I-95. So we've reached stasis. But notice out here out west, where the railroads end, travel goes back into the months. And so this is the classic Oregon Trail, the Conestoga wagons and such. Okay. Now at the start of the Civil War, here's what the railroad network looked like. And the colors on this chart designate the different gauges. And so you'll see that the South, particularly South Carolina, Georgia down there, they were mostly 5 foot gauge, even coming up into Virginia here. North Carolina and Virginia were mostly 4 foot 8.5, which is what most of New England and New York was, and even most of the Illinois area here. But you'll see there's some notable exceptions. The Erie was a 6 foot gauge railroad, and there were some other ones in here. And coming out of St. Louis, you have a 5 foot 6 foot gauge railroad. And then there are other oddball gauges down here. And these railroads are connecting towns to rivers because it was actually better at that time to ship things by boat than by rail. So you would start at a river and build out, and you would have an effective transportation system. Now, I mentioned that the South did not build any new lines during the war. Well, you can see these dotted lines. These are lines that they actually did build during the war, some over here too. And the way they did that was by pulling up rail in other places, either from sidings, and also this line was pulled up. Can you guys see my mouse, by the way? Can you see that on the screen? I hope. Okay. So what they did, this line was actually developed to short circuit ships coming from New Orleans so they wouldn't have to go around. And when the war broke out, that line wasn't being used, so it was sacrificed. Also, these black lines represent what the U.S. Military Railroad operated during the war. So you can see there's some pieces up here, not too many, and down here, but a lot of activity in this area. So why were there few rail-to-rail interchanges? Well, I explained that earlier. The railroad hotel industry and the transportation, the Teamster industry did not want you short-circuiting their services. And so here you see Richmond, which was actually very well served by rail. It had 4 lines coming in. And there's the, let's see, this is the C&O's tracks that go up through Hanover. Here's the RF&P coming down from Washington, the Richmond and Petersburg, Richmond and Danville. And notice none of them connect. They did at one point put a temporary line down here, ran some engines and things down it, and then pulled the line up. They didn't leave it there. But this wasn't just Southern phenomena. Northern cities were the same way. Here you see Boston with a whole slew of railroads that came into Boston, but they were all different stations. Okay, and Philadelphia was the same, although Philadelphia did have a few places where trains looked like they could interchange. In practice, they didn't. And there's the Delaware River. And Alexandria was an example of this phenomenon where we had three railroads coming in. We had the Orange and Alexandria there. We had the Washington and Alexandria Railroad here, and the Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire down here. And Alexandria was occupied by the Union the first day of the war. And the first casualties of the war happened in this house right here, the Marshall House. And the first thing they did was they put these red lines in, which connected the various railroads together, made the operations much more efficient. And those tracks stayed in there after the war and helped promote Alexandria as an effective railroad town. And the other thing the Union did was put tracks across the Long Bridge. Prior to this, if you were a commuter living in Alexandria and you wanted to go to Washington to work, you could take a train to where the Pentagon is now, the Long Bridge, but then you would have to get off the train and take a bus across the river and then probably take another bus to where you wanted to go. The Union also built the car ferry down here, which I'll talk about later. So here's some pictures of what was in Alexandria. And one of the things to note about the Civil War is that the negatives, the pictures that were taken back then were with negatives on 8x10 or 8x12 negatives. And so they're extremely high resolution. And so we're lucky that we have these pictures. The only drawback is we don't have that many of them. I believe if you go to the National Archives, they have about 6,000 Civil War images on hand, and about 3,000 of them are portraits. Whereas in comparison for World War I, if I remember correctly, there are 600,000 images, and in World War II, there are 6 million images. So not that many to go by, but there are enough to give us at least a good feel for what railroads look like. And this is a view from the top of that roundhouse looking west. And two things to notice. One, this is actually a panorama of 2 different photos that I stitched together. But notice that there aren't that many trees in these pictures. So trees were used as a building material, as a source of fuel, and so they were harvested pretty well. If you were to go stand on a roof of a building in Alexandria right now and look at the same scene, it would look like a forest with occasional buildings stuck in there. But back then, the trees were largely gone. And here's a scene from the north side of Alexandria, and you'll notice they have a radio antenna on this building. So we didn't think they had radios in the Civil War. Actually, I'm kidding. That's a flagpole. But this is the Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire station. And if you look real closely, you'd see my house would be right over there if my house was built back then. And this is all open farmland back then. Now it's houses with trees everywhere, including a hornet's nest this morning that invaded our neighborhood. Also notice the stockade that they put up to just protect it at night against any kind of sabotage or raiders and such. This is all gone now, by the way. Atlanta was an interesting exception. So in Atlanta, the tracks did come together, and mostly the railroads did not interchange, although I have seen some indications that a few cars were interchanged between the railroads that serviced Atlanta. And so here you see some photos taken during the fighting, and this was actually after the war down here. So I went through the Atlas of the Civil War and looked at all the maps of the cities and came up with this list of which cities had rail-to-rail interchanges and which ones didn't. And this is my list down here. And you'll notice that two of these, the U.S. Military Railroad did connect the tracks together. And so here's that long bridge I was mentioning earlier. So prior, the B&O ended there at the station, and you'd have to take a bus across the bridge, and Union did put a railroad tracks across that. And here's a picture of that. And the interesting thing about this picture is it's very busy, and you wonder what's going on. Well, it turns out they got word that rebel cavalry was going to raid Alexandria. And so they moved a lot of the equipment to the Maryland Avenue Depot for safekeeping. And the raid never materialized, and so this picture, they quickly sent the things back. But it's unfortunate in this photo that the Capitol in the background was really kind of, not too visible. And by the way, now this whole area is urbanized buildings. This would be the L'Enfant Plaza area. There is a train track coming through here, but it really doesn't look like this anymore. Okay, so let's switch to talk about what railroads were doing in the Civil War. And everyone tends to think about railroads in the Civil War. They think of the dictator mortar seen here, and what were they doing in terms of helping the fighting. But it turns out that was a very minor part of their role. And here we see what is probably the first railroad gun ever. And initially this was labeled in Library of Congress with an incorrect caption because these are Union soldiers looking at the gun. But David Schneider, professor from New Jersey at the time, did some research and proved that this gun was actually the Lee Brook gun that was used in the Battle of 7 Days. And then it was used once at Savage Station and never used again. And it's just not a practical concept to have a fixed cannon on a railroad like this because it's difficult to aim and it can only go where the tracks are. And so the concept was tried and it really wasn't that effective. And by the way, this particular gun, this cannon, I should say, or the gun, there's one similar one surviving at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. And that's where I got the measurements of how I could build this. So if the railroads, one more example of railroad guns. The B&O did build 5 armored cars and 5 rifle cars under the guidance of John Meigs, who was the son of the quartermaster Meigs. And this John was killed actually in the Civil War. Allegedly, these cars saw a lot of action and 2 were actually destroyed. And there are no pictures of this car. And so I worked with the B&O museum curator to try to come up with a plausible design. We know that they used existing railroad cars to build it and that they built them basically in a couple of days. So it couldn't be anything too fancy. And using some calculations and some descriptions, we came up with this design. So if railroads weren't fighting, what were they doing? Well, they were moving people, soldiers, and supplies. And this is an example of strategic movement. And I'll set the stage here. After the Battle of Gettysburg, there was a stalemate in Virginia. Meade and Lee really weren't strong enough to take each other on. They're still licking their wounds from the Gettysburg campaign. However, on the West, the South was losing the war. And so Lee recognized this and he told Longstreet to take 12,000 men, or take his corps, plus some reinforcements that made up to 12,000 men, and move to the Chattanooga area and stop Rosecrans. And so the Southerners moved their guys to Chattanooga. Some came from this vicinity, others came up from here. They couldn't cross Mobile, they had to take boats across there, and they had to actually walk this piece. But he was able to concentrate an army at Chickamauga. They defeated Rosecrans' army, and Rosecrans fell back into Chattanooga where the Southerners besieged him. And he was in trouble because he had no route of supply into that city. So the Northerners said, well, we're going to respond by sending reinforcements to Rosecrans. And so they shipped 11th and 12th Corps from Meade's army. The B&O Railroad helped set it up, and it was 4 different railroads that hauled them down there. It took them 15 days, but they stopped for 4 days to guard the line because Morgan had come up from Alabama and did a raid into Kentucky and came back. And once that was over, they continued on. They assembled at Chattanooga. Actually, General Hooker set up the Cracker Line. And meanwhile, Sherman and Grant came over from this vicinity. Sherman actually marched overland. He was nearly captured on the way. Grant went up the river, up to Cairo, and then back down and came over and took over command, immediately straightened out the supply situation using the Cracker Line, and had the Battle of Missionary Ridge and forced the Southerners down. At that point, Grant got promoted and went back to Washington, and Sherman took over and began the Atlantic Campaign, which basically was the end of the line for the Southerners, or the start of the end. So in terms of logistics, this is what a typical railroad or U.S. military railroad would haul in one day. So this is what my railroad would be hauling in a typical day. Oops. You can see that the largest by tonnage commodity was forage, which is feed for the animals. The Army of the Potomac had about 100 to 120,000 men in this time period and about 60,000 animals. And the animals needed a lot of feed. The men also required a lot of food. And so you can see that's how many cars each day were hauling forage. There were also various supplies being shipped back and forth. This is tents, weapons, uniforms, things like that. A lot of the soldiers were going on leave, and they could take the train up to the Aquia Landing where they could get on a boat and go visit their families. Also, families would ship stuff to their soldiers. And I read an account of a family shipping a cooked turkey to their son in Aquia Landing in the middle for Christmas. And I said to myself, well, how could you ship a cooked turkey without refrigeration back in the Civil War? And these people from upstate New York. Then a couple of years ago, I went to a wedding for one of my nieces in Syracuse in New York in January 1st. And when we got there, the temperature was 19 below 0 Fahrenheit. And then I realized, oh, now I know how they shipped that turkey. It froze solid while it was going down there. So anyway, they did stuff like that. The railroad was also moving supplies. The railroad was stockpiling equipment. And they were stockpiling some of those prefabricated bridges I mentioned earlier to go on to Richmond, which they didn't get to do. And the soldiers are training. Artillery and infantry would fire their weapons in training periodically, and so they consumed some ammunition, but not that much, at least on a percentage level. At the start of the war, supply depots were fairly basic, just had a siding or a piece of track. You didn't even need a siding. Cars would come in, they would be unloaded, and once you got off of a steamboat or a train, you were on muscle power, and so you had horse-drawn wagons or people moving those boxes around. But by the end of the war, at least on the Union side, the supply depots became very elaborate. And here we see City Point, a mile of wharves with dedicated facilities for forage, carpenter shops, sawmills. You can see a sawmill blade sitting right in the middle there. You can see a livestock car over here. They actually had their ammo stored in this area and exploded, probably by sabotage. So they later built another ammo wharf way off to the other side where it's isolating. So if that happened again, it wouldn't destroy anything. And at City Point was also the busiest harbor in the United States at this time. Excuse me. Interestingly enough, at the start of the war, the busiest harbor in the United States was New Orleans, not New York. And by the time the war went on, this was the busiest harbor in the country. They also built this car ferry, which was the first railroad car ferry. And it took stuff from Alexandria to various locations, primarily Aquia Landing in the time period I model. And then later they would go to City Point, and they even shipped a few barges to North Carolina. Now, there were other ferries that hauled railroad cars. A notable one would be on the Susquehanna River, where cars were put on the railroad, but these on the upper deck and people were on the lower deck. It's kind of odd, made the ferry top heavy. But this was the first case where you had an unpowered car float or car ferry. So Hopp invented this concept, and he claimed in a report that we found that this whole process took about an hour to load and unload these cars. Notice that they're loaded transversely, not longitudinally. So if you have 3 ramps in Alexandria and you have 8 cars, you've got to move the float at least twice to finish loading. And they did do that. The other places had fewer ramps and it would take a little bit longer. And as model railroaders, we like rolling stock. And we see an example here of freight cars in Nashville. And since we like to model different things, it's interesting that every one of these cars is slightly different from the others. So if you do like to model freight cars, there is some variety for you in the Civil War. Not as much as today where you have tank cars and intermodal cars and other specialized cars. But there are lots of different kinds of boxcars. Most of them were 28 foot. There were a few longer ones, some shorter ones. And this particular one we see here is a combination car, which had 2 sets of doors with iron bars or solid wood, depending on the cargo they were shipping. And you can see some with siding going that way and vertical siding. So lots of cool stuff that you can model in the Civil War. Here we see an Adams Express car, which was kind of like the Federal Express of today. And so if you were a soldier in the Civil War, you probably were going to send at least some of your pay home to your family. You couldn't really do that with the post office because it wasn't insured, but you could do it with the Adams Express Company because they would take a fee, but they would guarantee that the money got there. So you would go to your Adams Express agent, if there was one nearby, give them the money, and then they would either telegraph or send the actual money north, and your family would get it. So Adams Express, by the way, is still in business today. And I was looking through some newspapers, and I found this ad in the New York Times from 1862, where the Adams Express Company was telling their citizens that we're back open again to the Aquia Line, and these are the places that we service. And I have some records of train orders and things that I found where the express car is listed in the train, so I know that it was used in my area. And the Southerners also had a similar thing. And also, you can see a passenger car in the background, which I'll talk about in a second. And here we see a shot of a passenger car at City Point in 1864. And this is probably, although I'm not 100% sure of this, when Lincoln visited, they took a passenger car, they lined it with lead sheeting to provide some bulletproof protection, and they would take him up to visit the soldiers on the front. So it's possible that this is the first Air Force One, shall we say, where the president moved around. Now, they weren't building a much more elaborate car in the Alexandria shops for President Lincoln, but Lincoln never rode in this car as a live person. He did ride in it when it was his funeral train. Lincoln didn't particularly like the car. It was a little too ornate for him. He was more of a simple guy, didn't like this kind of stuff. When Lincoln visited my railroad, he visited several times, they would take a boxcar, put some benches in it, and decorate it with some bunting and call that the presidential car. And he even brought his wife and kids with him. This is a model of the presidential car in its funeral configuration that I built for the B&O Museum, and it's in their collection now. And the car has this bunting on it. This is a 1/32 scale model, so it's pretty big. It's probably about that big. And that bunting was really tough to make. I had to end up making a second car to use as a buck. Make the bunting out of 2-part epoxy, let it harden, and peel it off and glue it on. So a lot of work to do that. I don't want to do it again. You can have any locomotive you want in the Civil War as long as it's a 440. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but most of them were 440s. All of the engines used on my railroad were 440s. The U.S. Military Railroad did have some others. They had some mud diggers and some other things. But for the most part, they were like this. This is a very ornate example. This is the Devereaux. Beautiful locomotives, highly colorful, polished brass and all that. And the engines were powered largely by wood. And wood smoke is relatively easy to clean. And so these crewmen, when they stopped, they would get out and wipe everything down and try to get the car looking as spiffy as possible. And once later engines changed to coal, that kind of soot is much harder to clean. And railroads didn't want to spend the money cleaning that off. So that's why the engine switched kind of to the black schemes at that point, try to disguise the dirt. But in my era, we have very colorful, beautiful locomotives. And so here's an example of the B&O who has a 460. It's a nice locomotive. This is at the B&O Museum. The Northern Central had a pretty good variety of different kinds of locomotives. They were hauling coal, and actually the Northern Central was a coal burning railroad. The B&O had some coal burning locomotives too. Some of them actually ended up on the U.S. Military Railroad on the Orange and Alexandria line. They got a couple of those camelbacks. And so they had to bring coal down just for them to keep them supplied. So let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. And some of these things I've mentioned already, but obviously steam engines, there were no diesels back then. Another point to remember is that most of the rail was iron, not steel. Occasionally, I just finished reading a book about railroad raiders in the Civil War, and he mentioned steel. Well, very few railroads had steel. It was mostly wrought iron. In some cases, it was strap iron, which is just a piece of flat iron nailed to a board. And these rails wore out much quicker. Wrought iron rails wore out very fast. Steel rails lasted orders of magnitude longer. There were stub switches, not bladed switches. I'll show you an example in a second. A telegraph was used. We'll talk about that a little bit. Link and pin couplers, which were archaic, very dangerous way of connecting cars. Trucks had only one set of handbrakes. So actually modern trains are this way too, but that's all you had. There were no air brakes. And so you only had brakes on one truck and you would turn it with a brake wheel. So that is one of the reasons why I modeled working brakes on some of my cars. We had the first examples of hospital cars prior to the Union building hospital cars. Boxcars were considered ambulances and they would line them with straw. And so if you go through requisitions, you'll see that straw, clean straw, was listed as a medical supply because that's what they needed to make bunks and to prepare boxcars for transport. But Union soldiers, the Union medical officers realized their soldiers would survive better if they were treated better as they were transported. And so they came up with these hospital cars with bunks on rubber bushings. There would be an attendant in the car. It would have a stove to keep warm and it would have drinking water for them. I mentioned car ferries earlier and photography a little bit. Destruction of railroads, we'll talk about it in a little bit. It turns out that railroads are very hard to destroy. This is a lesson we have learned in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea. It's very hard to take out a railroad. And then they got really good at replacement bridge building, which we'll look at quickly. So here's an example of what stub switches look like. This is in Atlanta, and you see what actually this particular setup right here is a double slip switch, which I accidentally built one of these on my railroad. And it's a little bit confusing to operate, but you can see that the rails just end. So they were simple to build. That was their advantage. Their disadvantage was they took a lot of maintenance to keep engaged. And more importantly, if you came down this track and that switch was set that way, this car, if it comes down here, is going to derail. And so it acts like a derail, a modern derail. And so there was an accident in Colorado in the 1870s where 60 passengers were killed for that reason. And after that, Congress passed a law outlawing these types of switches on mainline track. And so they quickly were gotten away. Now I mentioned bridge building. Here we see an example of a wooden bridge over the Cumberland River, and it has some fortifications added to it to help protect it. But the remarkable thing about this bridge is this center section can rotate to allow steamboats to go by. So that's, I think, pretty impressive that they can build such elaborate structures out of wood and iron truss rods. I'm just very impressed with that. And I have no idea what this little kid's doing on this horse over here. And if you like big bridges, there were big bridges in the Civil War. This is the trestle that was rebuilt. It used to be a truss bridge over here. And then it got burnt when the Confederates retreated. And then the Union rebuilt this. And it stayed like that for several years after the war. So if you like big bridges, we got them. Now talk a little bit about operations. One of the things that people or military officers did not like to do was yield something in their sector to other people. And so military officers wanted to take control of the railroads, but they had no idea how to run railroads. And invariably that led into problems. And the best example I have of that is during the Peninsula Campaign, Lee sends a note to Jackson to move from the Shenandoah Valley back to the peninsula to help defeat McClellan. So Jackson was kind of a nut and he kept it secret, but all he told his officers was, we are moving to Richmond, seconds are hours, or minutes are hours. So the officers were afraid of Jackson because he had half of them under arrest at any one time. And so a regiment got to Gordonsville, they loaded on the train, and the colonel took 2 armed guards and got into the locomotive. and he ordered the locomotive engineer to move to Richmond and do not stop. Now, the men are pointing rifles at him. And the engineer says, okay, I'm not going to argue with you, we'll go. He knows full well that he has to meet a train at Hanover, but he doesn't say anything. Train takes off. It's night. He looks down at his watch. He realizes he's getting to Hanover, and the engineer jumps off the train. The train proceeds on, collides with the oncoming train, and there's an accident. And it's interesting because the Virginia Richmond newspapers report that there was an accident on the Virginia Central, and a woman and her child were killed. But if you read Train Riding for the Confederacy, which is memoirs of a Southern Railroad guy, he talks about how there were actually about 60 or 70 soldiers killed in that same accident. And so the newspaper censored that part of the story. So again, it goes back to my common theme of nothing changes in between then and now. So that was an example of an accident. There were a lot of accidents. If you read Southern Railroad Man, Snowden Bell's book, you'll see that not just during the war, but even after the war, he would lose. He was a conductor on various Southern railroads. He would lose at least one person a year on his trains. A lot of times they were drunks falling off the tracks, but a lot of others were accidents and bridges falling out, washout, all kinds of crazy stuff. You also had problems with the telegraph. So the railroads back then could use telegraph to control their movement. But when campaigning began, the military operations would hog and monopolize the telegraph, and the railroads couldn't get their messages through. And so as a result, if they didn't have their own line, they would have to run as a convoy or some other control mechanism to prevent the accidents. And one of the things that's interesting for me is winter quarters versus active campaigning. When you're active campaigning, the railroad stops operating as on the timetable and train order like it normally does. This is not entirely true, but it's largely true. And you do these convoys and things I just mentioned. But in winter quarters, particularly my railroad, it's running just like a normal railroad would be in peacetime, on a schedule, providing trains once every hour to the citizens. So that's why I picked a time of winter quarters. I think it would be, just from an operational perspective, more interesting than, say, running all your trains out and then running all your trains back. And there was a lot of guerrilla action, a lot of rails being cut, and we'll talk about that later. And again, the Great Locomotive Chase, I won't cover that because everybody knows about that, other than it was the first medals of honor that were issued as a result of that to the northern guys, some of the northern guys, not all of them. So what is timetable and train order? This is the early implementation of this. And really the rule books back then were very, very small. Now the rule book is 300 pages, and it's the rule book written in blood, because every time there's an accident, they would add a new rule. But back in the time of the Civil War, the U.S. Military Railroad's rule book was only 10 pages. And maybe 6 of those pages dealt with actual operations. The rest of it dealt with chain of command and some other things. The way it worked is a train ran on a schedule, and the most important rule is you didn't leave before your scheduled time. And this is what the dispatcher would use to keep track of his trains. So this is the Orange and Alexandria train sheet. You can see it's Alexandria, Burke, Fairfax, Devereux Station, Manassas, and then it repeats down here. And this is what was running on a typical day. Okay, and you can see in this particular case, they ran a lot of scheduled trains. So they did have a few extras. And in the time period that I'm modeling, an extra ran on the time of a scheduled train. It's not like now where you could issue a train order and have a just train run extra all by itself. Back then you would run extra on another train. So one train would leave, and then 5 minutes later, extra 6, for example, maybe up here, you'll see 6, extra 6 would leave, and it would run on the time, and there would be various signals on the train to control that operation so people knew what was going on. Also, on my railroad, you have to stop at every station to report in, and that was another method of control that allowed them to prevent accidents. Now, Herman Hopp was a very important Union officer who helped establish the United States Military Railroad, and he set up the organization. He built a construction corps, and he created sort of this, the operating department. And then because he got into trouble with the Secretary of War and some other political shenanigans that were going on in Massachusetts, again, nothing changes, he was actually forced to resign. So he didn't finish the war as a military officer, but his impact was felt throughout the war. And the people that he trained really continued on and helped the Union win the war. And these rules, some of the rules he came up with, I mentioned the no military officer interfere running the trains. One point he came across a train that was stopped in the middle of the track. He'd been waiting for it at the station, so he ran 8 miles, found the train, parked, and he said, "What's going on?" And the conductor engineer says, "Well, we have General such and such's wife sleeping in the house down there. She wants us to wait until she wakes up." And just then she came up and he chewed her out and sent the train on his way. So he was a very frank, very brusque guy, which rubbed a lot of people wrong. Supplies sent forward only as needed, unload immediately at the front. If you can't get the telegraph, run as a convoy. And if you ever see movie Patton and you see where Patton says, "Rommel, I read your book." Well, when we started the invasion of France, we ran into the same problems that they ran into in the Civil War with our trains. The Quartermaster Corps was not unloading the boxcars that were coming from the ports at the forward points. So they were hoarding the boxcars at the forward points. As a result, the American and British Army ran out of supplies at the end of September, right? Remember, we started the Red Ball Express to try to keep them supplied. But the reason that happened was they were not following Hopp's principles. They were not unloading the cars and sending them back immediately. So what I tell is Patton should have read Hopp's book and not Rommel's book, or maybe he should have read both of them. I don't know. Now, the telegraph I've mentioned several times. Telegraph was a very important feature, not just for running the railroads, but also just in general for military operations. Again, it's another place where the Union had big advantages over the South. And if you look at some of the people involved in this, this is Andrew Carnegie. He was one of the telegraph operators for the U.S. military railroad in the Civil War. This guy is Homer Bates. He wrote this book about telegraphs in the Civil War. It's called Telegraph in the White House. And you can get this book online for free. Highly recommend you read it because it gets back to this thing about nothing changes in Washington. And you can read about how telegraph operators were censoring messages from the generals because they thought the messages were insubordinate and they didn't want the president to see them. And all kinds of, they knew that they could actually be executed for doing this, but they did it anyway. This guy here is the, I'm forgetting his name right now, but he was became the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Tom
Scott.
Scott, yeah, I actually read, there's a guy who wrote a thesis about his life, and I read that, and it's, again, he was a good guy, but he had some corruption problems in his background that haunted him throughout the war. Plus, he was associated with Cameron, who was the president of the Northern Central, and Lincoln said when Cameron quit, make sure you count all the Civil War in the White House. So these guys were kind of known for a little bit for their corruption, or maybe a lot. Anyway, let's talk quick about railroads and how hard they were to destroy. And this is a lesson we learned in Vietnam when we thought we were destroying Vietnam's railroad tracks, and we weren't. The problem is that it's easy to replace the rails and the ties if you have them online, and even bridges can be rebuilt. This is the bridge over Bull Run. It was probably built 10, 20 times during the war. I don't even know the exact number. They could build that bridge in less than a day. And to destroy a railroad really took two things. And Hopp says that this guy Smead, who worked for Hopp in Virginia, and then moved out and supported, ran the railroads for Sherman. He says this is the single individual who was most responsible for Union victory in the war. So that was Herman Hopp's nomination for that award. But he was very modest. He never wrote a book. So Hopp put a chapter in his memoirs about this guy. But one of the things he invented were these little hooks. And this is in Alexandria where they're testing the hooks. And you carry these little metal hooks in your saddlebags. And when you get to a spot where you want to destroy, you find a log and you connect the log, or these guys are using ropes and logs. This is down in Atlanta. And you twist the rail and then you can bend it around the tree. But if you just bend the rail around the tree, it can be re-straightened by picking it up and dropping it successively, heating it up and dropping it. But if you twist it like this, it has to go back to the rolling mills to be repaired. So a rail twisted like this is almost impossible to repair in the field. So when Sherman wants to destroy a railroad line, he takes a division of infantry and he parks it on 10 miles of track. And in one day, they tear up every line and twist them and bend them. They burn every tie. And then they take their shovels and they dig the embankments and put them back in the fills. So it's going to take months to repair that line without having a division of infantry, 10,000 men to do it. And that's what he did to the railroads in Georgia, utterly devastated them so they couldn't be repaired. Okay, so this is a summary. I don't know how much time I have left. I think I'm done, right? Am I done, Nick? Nick, are you there? He's not there. That's a summary of some of the things I talked about. And if he wants me to continue, and I'll continue until he kicks me off, I'll show you some of the examples of my model railroad. So I was going to take a break here, but we'll see. So this explains why do they want to model the Civil War? Well, I was born in New York. The Civil War was ancient memory. My dad did build this little model railroad for us in our basement in New York. And that's my twin brother and I. And this goes to show that model railroading is a chick magnet, because I have no idea who that girl is, but man, she wanted to see our train. So anyway, when I moved to Virginia, the Civil War surrounds you down here. This is the first two casualties of the Civil War. That's the Johnson who shot, shoot, I'm drawing a blank now. I think of his name in a second. He was the first officer killed, and then this guy bayoneted that guy. And so that was the first Southern and the first officer killed. And so I got interested in the Civil War. I had already been doing military modeling of the Civil War. These are some dioramas that I built in large scale. And I concluded that railroads were interesting for these various reasons. We have the timetable and train order. Our engines are very colorful. They have personality. They have names. The equipment itself is smaller. So here you see an O-scale locomotive, an HO diesel, and an N-scale diesel. So you can see an O-scale locomotive is not much bigger than an HO diesel. And it was the first railroad war. I talked about that earlier. And so here we just see a little example of a little scene on my railroad. You can see the stub switch she went over right there. Whoops, well, I went backwards. And so in terms of the area that I modeled, of all Harrow Railroad Net, I modeled that little piece right there. It's a 13-mile Aquia line. Here's where we are. So there's the Potomac River. Washington is up here. Richmond is down there. This is Fredericksburg right here. And this is Aquia Landing. So to take a train from Washington to Richmond back then, you came down by boat. You got off at the Aquia Landing, and then you took a train down these tracks to Richmond. So in 1862, 1863, the Union Army was encamped here. Robert E. Lee was on the south. He was widely spread out because of the supply issues I mentioned. And so I'm modeling this railroad here. And I'll keep showing pictures until Nick tells me I'm done. This is the opposite end of the car ferry down on the Aquia Landing. And you can see they have tracks on the pier. The pilings to this pier are still in the river. In low tide every now and then you can see them. But for the most part, this is all gone. They made a state park out of the land back here. Here are various scenes. And again, this gets back to the point that once you leave the rails, you're on human power. And so you can see all these people. They're working to unload the trains. The amazing thing about these pictures is you can zoom in and see details in their buttons, their ties, everything. Here you see a wife visiting her officer husband, and they stayed with them for a while, so that was possible. And in this picture, if you look closely, you can see some freed slaves who are either leaving and heading north, or they're actually working for the railroad, finally getting paid for their labor. There were 4 stations on the line, and we have some pictures. Stoneman Station, we actually have a couple pictures. These are different views. And we have this drawing of a 2-year regiment going home. Unfortunately, at Brook, my first station, I don't have any pictures. There was a big bridge at Potomac Creek. It was burned at least 3 times during the war. Actually, this one was burned too. I chose to build this one down here. I'll show you in a second. I thought that was a very interesting bridge. I had to selectively compress it about 50%. What scale to pick? There are some great models. I saw Tom's on board. So this is Tom's railroad up here. At a similar railroad down in Atlanta, LeBron, although LeBron is building his. I dabbled in 1/32 scale, and I even did some N-scale stuff, but the N-scale didn't run well enough when I was starting. They're in a little better shape now because they have decent locomotives, but back when I started, there weren't any. So I went with O-scale. And one of the drawbacks you see is O-scale is big. you're going to need a bigger layout. So this is my wife with an O-scale boat that I wanted to put on the railroad. And so I did have some guys working in my house, and for a tiny fee, they reconfigured some of the walls of my basement to give me this whole space here. It's a 1,000 square foot basement. I'm currently in my office down here, and the railroad wraps around the rest of my basement. And now it's actually expanding. Nick, tell me when you want me to stop, because I'm going over.
Well, we started a little late, so I was figuring if you want to do a couple more minutes, maybe we'll stop at 5 after and open the floor for questions.
All right, so there's some pictures of my railroad. I'm going to skip through these real quick because this takes too long to describe all this. And I'll just show you some pictures, some pretty pictures at the end. Oh, this one, you might want to see this one here. Okay, this is how the working brakes work on my cars. So you turn the knob, and that runs a 4-bar linkage in that one truck that I mentioned earlier. Don't do it too tight or you'll derail the car, but then the brakes hold. We don't really do this in op sessions, only if the car is rolling out of a siding that you really set the brakes. For the most part, we don't do it. I also wanted to show you this little video. This is the mock-up of the Telegraph, or I should say the prototype, because it actually is working. So you can see the sender. We have a computer chip that's generating the Morse code. So all you have to do is push the button at the station, and it will generate a message that the dispatcher will listen to. And it's based on the military railroad dot code, which was developed for easy training. It wasn't as fast as railroad Morse, but you just have to count dots. And so in the computer software that runs this, the speed of the dots is selectable. And so I have it going pretty slow so I can keep up with it. Who knows, maybe someday I'll get better at it, I don't know. Okay, so that's that. That's my dispatcher's office. That's what it looks like when we're running a train. We have our Civil War group that Tom and others are on. And if you're interested in the Civil War railroading, you can join this group. I think there's like a $5 fee to help pay for our gigabytes of storage, because we have a lot of stuff, pictures and files stored on that thing. So we all chip in a little bit of money. And here's just some pretty pictures of my railroad. And I'll be happy to take questions now if anybody's got them.
Hey, Bernie, we did have one question that from Tom in the chat I think that was a 100-pound Parrott rifle on the rail car. And was that not a project that was suggested by Robert E. Lee during the Peninsula campaign?
Yes, it was. Robert E. Lee sent a note to the engineer who built the Virginia, which was the former Merrimack, and he suggested a rail car. That engineer built the gun, the rail gun, in the same style of construction as the Virginia. One correction, it was not a 100-pound rifle, a 100-pound Parrott. I don't remember what it actually is. I'd have to look it up in my references. But there is one of those guns that survived, and it's over at the Navy Yard. It was captured in Louisiana and shipped home kind of as a trophy. It's not a Parrott rifle though, it's something else.
Was it like a Blakely rifle or something?
If you really want to know, I'll have to look it up. I
That's
don't
okay.
remember. I have the dimensions for it because I went over and measured it. It's on my blog. If you really want to know, I recommend just go look at my blog, type in railguns, and it'll take you to the page where I talk about that particular gun.
All right. Now, I had a question about that B&O armored car that you had built. I have researched that, and it has been really difficult to find any accurate data. Is basically that the best that you could gather in terms of construction and shape? Because I think someone had done a master's thesis that had a drawing of it, and it looked incredibly narrow for what it was supposed to be.
Yeah, there are lots of artist concepts of what that particular gun looked like. And I worked with Dan Toomey, who was a curator of the B&O Museum, and he had a lot of documentation, including Meade's actual written description of what it looked like. And we did some engineering again. That's just all on my blog if you want to see it. But initially they mounted the cannon on slings, and so that way they could get the gun in there. But what happens when you fire a gun that's on slings? It goes, sing, doesn't work too well. And so they put a field piece in there. And it was, I believe, a 6-pounder. Again, all these things I built that thing over 10 years ago, so I'm forgetting some stuff. But what I did was went from the descriptions and then calculated the weight of the rail that was used to armor the car, and calculated that anything more than what we show would have overwhelmed the car, because they were built on the chassis of a 10-ton boxcar. So you basically had to have slightly less than 10 tons of ammo, or correction, armor, and also have a gun that weighs a couple 100 pounds. And again, I don't remember any of these numbers. I'm a mechanical engineer. It's funny, but I don't remember numbers. I remember concepts. So that's what we came up with. The fact that they put a field piece in there, and that it had to be less than 10 tons, and it had some taper and such, and it had to fit on double track. All these things conspired to the shape that we came up with. And Dan said, you know, this makes sense, let's go with it. So that's how we ended up with the shape that we ended up with. You know, if somebody else proves us wrong, we'll be happy to build a new one.
Okay. I have 2 questions from Andrew Sisk. The first one was, what actual memorabilia do you have personally in your collection from the Civil War railroads?
I think the answer to that is none.
Okay.
I would like to, but there was a guy selling a Lincoln pin up in Pennsylvania a couple months ago. And he gave me his card, which is right here. And then I said to myself, do I really want a hunk of iron laying around my house? It's probably not even from the Civil War. So the guy who has some of that stuff is our buddy, DC Sabula. He has paperwork mostly. Oh, I take it back. I do have some memorabilia. My father-in-law gave me a piece of Confederate currency that is hanging in my guest bathroom down here. So I guess I have one piece of money from the Confederacy.
Fair enough. I would add that if you do get a Lincoln pin, get the link, and it makes a really convenient letter holder for your desk. Because at the Barriger curator's office, there is a link from a Lincoln pin, and that's what I use it for.
Well, the reason I wanted to get one was to give to my brakemen when they're operating, because I have, when you come to my railroad and operate, you get a little bag with the links and the pins. My pins are track nails and my links are laser cut out of this resin material. So I said, you need to carry this around for a half hour and then give it to the next guy, so everybody knows what it's like to carry one of these. And just think, after the Civil War, when railroads started interchanging and every railroad had a slightly different link design.
Yeah.
As a brakeman, you might have to carry 3 or 4 of these down to get one that fit. So it was crazy.
And Andy has one more question. For your video, how did you simulate the 440 steam exhaust?
I use a program called Adobe Premiere, and the steam, you know, it's like a Hollywood special effect that I just generated. If you go back to that, you'll notice the flags were also flying. Did you guys notice that?
I did. That's cool.
Yeah, that was done again with Photoshop, or not Photoshop, but Adobe Premiere. Let's see if I can get back to that. One more look at one thing I realized is that it's hard to do special effects. It probably took me a week to make that little clip. Hey, what happened? What's going on here? My computer's going crazy.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, so you see the flags flying?
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't really do that on my railroad. And the next step is to do green screen and have this guy moving the coal. So I need to get somebody to pose for me while I film them from a green screen with a little log. One of the things I toyed with was making a little movie like Brian Camera's movie. He did a really great semi-cartoon model-based video, full-length feature really. And my story was going to involve the Aquia Line and President Lincoln's visit. And the Confederates hear about it and they tried to kidnap him. So that was going to be my story. But I just haven't figured out how the best way to do it, to make it a written story or a comic book, or even try it as a video. So in my copious spare time, I'll work on that.
Oh, fantastic.
I am retired now, but it seems like I got busier than ever.
Yeah, everyone I know who's retired has said, what happened to my free time?
Yeah.
I have a personal question. If you were going to do this again from scratch and build your layout for the Civil War, would you do it again in the same scale, or would you go to something like HO, looking at the quality of the stuff that's coming out now from Shapeways or the manufacturers? Or do you still think that your current O scale is the best size to work with for this kind of material?
I would not do it in HO or N. I would probably stick with O, and crazy, I might even go to 1/32 scale. The reason for that is because I'm primarily a model builder, although I do enjoy operating my railroad. And in the 1/32 scale, every military item imaginable is available, except for the railroad stuff. So you'd have to scratch build all your railroad stuff. But I ended up doing that anyway in O scale. And so one of the things I like to do as a hobby is to paint figures, and the 1/32 figures are really, really good. O scale figures are okay. HO and N scale figures really aren't that great. And so I think if I did it again, I might go bigger. If I was stuck in the same house, there's not much more I could do really. I pretty much optimized the railroad for this house. I went with Hop's railroad because I liked Herman Hopt. I thought it'd be cool. We have the high bridge. That's one of the things I wanted to model, plus the waterfront. If I did it again, I would conceivably do City Point Line, which a lot of people do. I thought about maybe the B&O, and then also the Nashville and Chattanooga is a really neat railroad because of the mountains. But at this point, I do not plan on building another basement filling railroad. My modeling itch will be satisfied with smaller projects, maybe modules and things. Right over here, there's a spot in my office where I have a 10-foot wall that I'm thinking about building a small railroad up there. And it might be what I call the movable feast, where I do different subjects. So right now it's a modern port. I'm thinking maybe a World War II harbor scene. I think that might be cool. So my wife said no more World War I. I did a World War I project for my book, and sold most of it, and actually going to sell. There's a guy who wants to buy the rest of it. So anyway, yeah. Did I answer your question? Sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah, no, you did. Thank you. Okay, if anyone else does have any more questions, now's your chance to put them into the chat. Tom Radis once again mentioned that the camera movie is The Other Great Locomotive Chase. So for folks who want to see that,
it's on YouTube now. I don't think he sells them anymore. I have the DVD, but I think you can just go to YouTube and watch it. It's really, I've watched it at least 10 times. It's just hilarious. The guy is so creative. By the way, I give him a shout out. He painted some of the artwork that I use in my backdrop. So all the camp scenes, like I paint the sky and the clouds and the hills, but if I have a camp, I use his artwork because he's great at people and horses. Yeah. And he's also painted Tom's backdrops too, if I recall.
Yep. And we have one more question. Have you been approached by any museums wanting your model railroad?
No, I have not. Although there is a museum down in Fredericksburg, actually on the north side, called the White Oak Museum. They have a lot of space. And I'm thinking when the time comes, I might donate whatever pieces they want to their museum. It would be a shame to just waste all this and tear it down and put it in the dump. But I know I have sold layouts in the past that I've built. You never get what they're worth. And this one would be very hard to do that. So it would be conceivable to saw out pieces and ship pieces. But yeah, I don't want to think about that right now. I'm 65, so that time is getting closer, but it isn't here yet. So we'll wait. I'm not planning on tearing this out though. My friends that know me well are shocked that this railroad has lasted 13, 14 years now. Why is that? Because it's still not finished, and it does satisfy a lot of the interest that I have. And that's what's a hobby, right? That's what's important.
Yep.
And it's really, because of my blog and I built this railroad, some amazing things have happened. For example, right now I've been commissioned to build a model of the slave quarters or the slave jail that was in Alexandria for a new museum they're building. And I've done other Civil War projects for other museums. And I like doing museum projects because I really like to build, and I'm running out of space here to store stuff. And I like having my stuff out for other people to see. So I'm more than happy to build things for museums. So.
Okay, excellent. I don't see any new questions. So
Okay.
once again, on behalf of the Barriger Library and all of our attendees today, thank you again, Bernie, for sharing your layout, your knowledge, and your passion for this. This has been just great.
Thank you.
I admit, I read your blog regularly, if nothing else, just to see what's going on with the layout. So since I live in a 2-bedroom apartment, I don't get to live this dream yet. So I'm a lot of people who model, I'm living vicariously through their basements.
Well, I was going to put up the last page, which I think has the blog info if anybody wants to see. Oh, wait a minute, I just went right by it.
Ah, great.
Where is it? Yeah, and if anybody's in the Alexandria, Washington, D.C. area, you know, now that COVID is kind of winding down, we're having visitors, especially if you've been vaccinated. Whoops. All right, there we go. There's my blog, and that's my little company down below. So if you want to check me out, I don't post as regularly as I have been because I'm not really doing much on the railroad this particular time. Although coming up in the next month, I have to finish my expansion because I'm supposed to host an op session with the Civil War Railroad Historical Society. And then a couple weeks later, some dudes from California are coming for an op session. So I've got to get ready. That's the expansion right there. Oops. So it's going across this wall. You can see the hole where the tunnel is.
Mm-hmm.
The expansion is going through there. I've got all the bench work in. I've got some of the track down. It'll be in here. So, but there will be an article in MRP describing this, so you can read more about it, or you could just go to my blog and get the blow by blow.
All right. I know at least one person who will. So. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Bernie. We appreciate you taking your time today to do this. We're gonna take a couple minutes because we're gonna have to hand off from Bernie and get John going and set up here. And if anybody came in late, I know we had a bunch of people join us after we got started. This is being recorded. It's going to be available through the Mercantile Library's webpage for anyone who missed it. And certainly, if anyone has questions later on, you can email me and I can get you in contact with both Bernie and John for any questions you may have after today. So thank you very much. And let's see, bring up John here.